The German naval forces had a derisive term for the British destroyers in the early stages of World War II. They referred to them as tin cans, a dismissive label that underscored the perceived fragility of these vessels. Weighing around 1,400 tons and armed with 4.7-inch guns, the British destroyers seemed woefully inadequate when compared to Germany's heavy cruisers, which displaced 10 times their tonnage and carried 8-inch armor-piercing shells. The mathematics of naval warfare appeared to be brutally straightforward. A destroyer encountering a heavy cruiser was expected to either flee or be destroyed. German naval doctrine, refined since the First World War, emphasized the overwhelming advantages of armor, firepower, and displacement. Their officers were trained on the principle that ship classes existed in a strict hierarchy, with destroyers relegated to the role of screening for the capital ships. The naval hierarchy was well established, with cruisers hunting destroyers and battleships reigning supreme. The Royal Navy recognized these dynamics, designing their destroyers for speed, torpedo strikes, and convoy protection rather than direct confrontations with heavily armored vessels. While the thin hulls of these ships were vulnerable to penetration, the textbook predictions did not account for the human element. The decisions made in the heat of crisis by commanders unwilling to accept the inevitable. The Germans dismissed these tin cans as posing no real threat in direct combat, a perception soon to be challenged in the frigid waters. The frigid waters of Norway in 1940 witnessed an unexpected turn of events. As spring approached, the German naval forces were meticulously preparing Operation Weserübung, a daring plan to simultaneously invade Denmark and Norway. Admiral Roope had convinced Hitler that the Scandinavian ports were crucial for Germany's naval strategy, providing access to the Atlantic and denying Britain's forward bases. The operation would deploy virtually every major surface unit in Germany's arsenal, including the formidable heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper. Commissioned in 1939, this modern warship boasted 8 8-inch guns in 4 turrets, a top speed of 32 knots, and armor belts up to 3.1 inches thick. Facing this formidable vessel, the Royal Navy had dispatched the G-class destroyer HMS Glowworm. The Glowworm, a compact yet formidable vessel, emerged in 1936. Equipped with 4 4.7-inch guns in individual turrets, she measured 323 feet in length, with hull plating thin enough to potentially be penetrated by heavy machine gun fire in certain areas. Her primary armaments were her 10 21-inch torpedo tubes and her impressive speed of 36 knots. In the strategic landscape of 1940, the Glowworm was designed to launch torpedo attacks against enemy capital ships, preferably under the cover of darkness, and then swiftly disengage using her agility and velocity. The very notion of engaging a heavy cruiser at close quarters, let alone making physical contact, contradicted the fundamental tenets of destroyer warfare. Yet, within a matter of days, this diminutive vessel would challenge the entire premise of naval hierarchy in a manner that would reverberate through history. In 1939, the seasoned Lieutenant-Commander Gerard Roope assumed command of the HMS Glowworm, a vessel manned by a crew of 146. Roope, a capable and determined officer, had dedicated his career to the Royal Navy since his youth, steadily rising through the ranks with a methodical professionalism that earned the respect of his subordinates. Unlike some of his more audacious counterparts, Roope was known for his adherence to orders, disciplined leadership, and technical expertise in operating his ship. The Glowworm was part of the first destroyer flotilla assigned to the Home Fleet, based out of Scarpa Flow, tasked with defending the nation's shores. The Orcadian archipelago off Scotland's northern coast had settled into a monotonous rhythm for destroyer crews in the opening months of 1940. The anticipated grand naval confrontations had failed to materialize, replaced by the endless grind of convoy escort duties, submarine patrols, and the relentless North Atlantic weather that tested ships and sailors alike with unforgiving severity. In early April 1940, British naval intelligence detected heightened German naval activity, though the full scale of Operation Weserübung remained obscure. The Admiralty dispatched multiple destroyer squadrons to conduct reconnaissance and interdiction patrols along the Norwegian coastline. Glowworm received orders to join the battlecruiser HMS Renown and other destroyers in laying mines in Norwegian waters near Vestfjord, part of a broader strategic operation. The British forces were determined to disrupt the potential flow of iron ore shipments from Narvik to Germany. This operation, though seemingly routine, was the kind that destroyers had been executing for months. RP meticulously prepared his ship and crew for departure, ensuring the fuel bunkers were filled, the ammunition lockers were fully stocked, and all mechanical systems were functioning flawlessly. The 4.7-inch guns were tested, the torpedo tubes were inspected, and the Parsons-geared turbines were brought up to operational temperature. On April 6, 1940, Glowworm set sail from Scapa Flow as part of a small task force, heading northward into the increasingly treacherous conditions of the North Sea. The early April North Sea was notoriously hazardous, with its cold, gray, and unpredictable weather that could suddenly reduce visibility. The harsh conditions of the open sea posed formidable challenges, transforming routine operations into trials of maritime expertise. By 5:49 on April 7, the weather had deteriorated considerably. Towering waves assaulted the destroyers, and freezing spray coated their exposed metal surfaces. At 5:57, RP and his officers maintained their position in the formation, but the grueling circumstances strained every aspect of shipboard life. Sailors labored in the biting cold and damp. 603 constant vigilance was required to prevent equipment from sustaining freeze damage, and navigation became a matter of dead reckoning as visibility plummeted to near zero levels. 608 undaunted, the task force pressed northward through the night, unaware that they were steaming almost directly toward the German invasion fleet. At that moment, 615 Admiral Hipper, commanded by Captain Zare Hellmouth High, was leading a group on a converging course. Trondheim, transporting 1,700 German soldiers. The two forces were on a collision course, though neither was yet aware of the impending encounter. What transpired next would be determined not by grand strategic planning or naval doctrine, but by a single moment of human vulnerability. A sailor falling overboard in the tumultuous seas and a commander's decision on whether to turn back. The evening of April 7 presented conditions that made every movement on deck perilous. Waves pounded Glowworm's bow, and the howling wind tore through the superstructure with enough force to knock a man off balance. Visibility had diminished to a mere 100 yards in the driving sleet and spray. Around 8 p.m., as the crew labored to, the violent motion of the vessel had caused some equipment to come loose, and in the chaos, a crewmate was swept away by a sudden, powerful wave that swept across the deck. The alarm was raised at once, as a man overboard in such frigid waters meant their chances of survival were slim at best. The North Sea's temperature in April typically hovers around 6 to 8 degrees Celsius, cold enough to induce a life-threatening cold shock response within seconds and lead to unconsciousness within 15 minutes, even for an experienced swimmer. The naval commander now faced a dreaded decision: continue the formation's advance towards the operational objective or break off the mission to search for the missing sailor in the darkness, heavy seas, and near zero visibility. Naval doctrine provided clear guidance on such situations. The mission's paramount importance became evident, particularly during wartime operations when deviating from formation could jeopardize other vessels or compromise operational security. A single sailor's life weighed against strategic objectives and the entire crew's safety, resulting in a predetermined outcome. Many commanders would have continued with regret but a clear conscience. RP issued the order to turn back, and Glowworm faced the storm, her crew scanning the black waters for any trace of the lost sailor. The ship's searchlights pierced the darkness, revealing driving rain and turbulent waves, but little else. Throughout the night of April 7 and into the early morning of April 8, the search persisted. Glowworm diligently scanned the suspected region where the crewmen had fallen overboard, maintaining a steady pace to avoid overshooting potential sighting areas. The engineering team carefully regulated the ship's revolutions, ensuring she maintained steerage without drifting too far. Lookouts braced themselves against the deck's pitching, their eyes strained by the harsh conditions. With each passing minute, the sailors' chances diminished, but the search continued. By the dawn of April 8, the grim reality became undeniable. The man had been claimed by the North Sea, like countless others before him. RP ordered a course set to rejoin Renown and the other destroyers, but the night's search had significantly diverted Glowworm from her original heading. The storm had also scattered the British formation. Glowworm had become isolated, situated roughly 160 kilometers northwest of Trondheim, striving to return to her designated 940 position through dead reckoning, as visibility remained severely limited. Encrypted transmissions 948 crackled over the ship's radio, but contact with the main fleet was intermittent. What RP was unaware of 954 was that his choice to search for a single sailor had placed his vessel directly in the path of Admiral Hipper and her 1001 escorting destroyers, which were approaching the Norwegian coast as scheduled for the invasion's opening 1008 maneuvers. Around 8 o'clock on April 8, 1940, Glowworm's 1016 lookout sighted dark shapes emerging from the fog ahead. These shapes resolved into German destroyers racing 1023 forward. RP commanded his crew to assume battle readiness, hurrying to positions they had meticulously rehearsed but never before employed in real conflict. The adversaries were the German destroyers Z-11 Bern von Arnim and Z-18 Hans Ludman, modern vessels from the 1934 A-class, escorting the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper toward Trondheim. Their lookouts detected Glowworm nearly simultaneously, and both sides went to action stations within moments. RP's tactical circumstances were immediately intricate. He had encountered enemy warships in Norwegian waters, providing vital intelligence about German movements that required transmission to Admiral T. Yet broadcasting a contact report would expose his location and invite assault, while his operational directives mandated investigation. The German warships had already turned their attention towards the Glowworm, their 5-inch guns outmatching the British destroyer's 4.7-inch armament by a small margin. While the numerical advantage and firepower lay with the Germans, the outcome of a destroyer-on-destroyer engagement often came down to seamanship, gunnery precision, and the split-second decisions made in the heat of battle. Recognizing this, the Glowworm's commander ordered an increase in speed and maneuvered to maintain a longer firing distance, all the while transmitting an urgent contact report. The message was sent out at 8:15 hours, relaying the enemy destroyer's position at approximately 64 degrees north, 5 degrees east. The German ships opened fire first, their shells splashing down around the Glowworm as they honed in on the target. The thunderous roar of the wind and sea was punctuated by the sharp crack of 4.7-inch shells as the engagement unfolded into a frenzied chase. RP, a seasoned veteran of nearly 2 decades, expertly maneuvered Glowworm, utilizing her agility to evade the German ranging solutions. Shells screamed overhead or exploded in the water, drenching the deck with a spray of seawater. The range fluctuated between 8,000 and 12,000 yards as both formations jockeyed for position. After several minutes of this intense exchange, RP made a tactical decision based on the circumstances at hand. The German destroyers were attempting to box him in, employing a strategy of bracketing their target. Faced with the numerical superiority of his adversaries, he recognized that his best chance for survival and escape lay in breaking through their line by leveraging his vessel's superior speed, and then making a desperate dash for open waters where he might potentially lose them amidst the inclement weather. Ordering his crew to push the engines to their maximum capacity, the destroyer surged forward at over 35 knots, her bow cleaving through the waves and sending plumes of spray high into the air. As a smokescreen obscured his approach, the German gunners struggled to maintain an accurate fix on the rapidly moving target, their fire falling erratically within the artificial fog. The massive gray silhouette of the formidable Admiral Hipper emerged from the obscuring smoke, its 4 twin turrets ominously trained on the much smaller destroyer that had suddenly materialized at close quarters. The heavy cruiser, weighing in at over 150 tons fully loaded, dwarfed the Glowworm, its displacement exceeding that of the destroyer by more than tenfold. The Admiral Hipper's fearsome 8-inch guns could hurl 270-pound shells capable of penetrating substantial armor at ranges exceeding 16 miles, while its secondary 4.1-inch armament matched the Glowworm's main battery in both number and firepower. For a brief moment, it appeared that RP's gamble might pay off. But at approximately 1338, the Glowworm burst through its own smokescreen, and RP was confronted with the grim reality of the situation. The control systems had failed, and the destroyer found itself face to face with the overwhelming might of the German heavy cruiser. The British destroyer Glowworm's relentless advance had brought her within 6,000 yards of the German cruiser Admiral Hipper by 1426, despite the clear signs that retreat would be the prudent course. Admiral Hipper's main battery then opened fire, with the first salvo's deafening roar echoing the sound of fabric being torn 1,000-fold. These 8-inch shells, displacing massive volumes of air, produced a distinctive sound that no sailor who had experienced it could ever forget. The shells landed in the water beyond Glowworm, erupting in towering white geysers. While the German captain had been caught off guard by the sudden appearance of the British destroyer, his crew's extensive training and proficient fire control systems ensured they were ready to respond. The mighty Admiral Hipper, a formidable cruiser, dominated the seas with her unparalleled capabilities. As the second salvo at 1508 drew closer, the options for the opposing vessel dwindled to virtually none. Fleeing at 1514 proved futile, as the Hipper's superior speed of 32 knots and her longer, more substantial frame provided exceptional seaworthiness, even in the tumultuous waves. The cruiser's advanced fire control system could track targets to the horizon, and her devastating shells could reach the target regardless of evasive maneuvers at 1532. Surrender did not appear to be a consideration, even momentarily, for the determined commander. The only recourse, however suicidal it may have seemed, was to attack at 1547. The 4.7-inch guns were readied, and the torpedo tubes prepared for launch, as the crew braced for a desperate confrontation with the formidable Admiral Hipper. The German cruiser unleashed a barrage of 1555 projectiles, their arcing trajectories aimed squarely at the heavy warship. Several 1601 rounds found their mark, with witnesses aboard Admiral Hipper reporting impacts on the superstructure and a shell that penetrated near the 1607 waterline. However, the 4.7-inch shells, carrying 50-pound warheads designed to target 1613 destroyers and submarines, lacked the punch to significantly damage the heavily armored cruiser. While they could kill 1618 exposed personnel and damage unprotected areas, they could not inflict critical harm on a vessel built to 1625 withstand 8-inch gunfire. Meanwhile, Admiral Hipper's third salvo achieved a 1631 straddle, with shells landing both short and long, indicating the next volley would likely find its target. The German gun crews were 1637 honing in on their objective. At E09-E5 hours, an 8-inch shell struck Glowworm's forward section. The Glowworm's crew fought valiantly, but the enemy's relentless barrage proved too much to withstand. A shell pierced the thin hull plating, detonating inside and instantly killing several sailors. Flames spread rapidly despite their efforts to control the damage. Another projectile destroyed one of the ship's 4.7-inch gun mounts, reducing it to twisted metal and human fragments. The Glowworm was being systematically dismantled by weapons it could not effectively counter. Amidst the chaos, the torpedo crews managed to launch several 21-inch Mark IX torpedoes, each carrying a 750-pound Torpex warhead capable of crippling a cruiser. However, hitting a maneuvering target in the heavy seas, while under relentless bombardment, required as much luck as skill. Admiral Hipper's helmsman skillfully evaded the Glowworm's torpedoes, throwing the cruiser into a hard turn. The ship's maneuvers had been swift, but the torpedoes had passed without incident, their wakes visible in the somber waters. The engagement had scarcely lasted a quarter hour, yet Glowworm was succumbing. Uncontrolled fires ravaged multiple compartments, and the forward section exhibited severe structural damage. Casualties mounted as shrapnel tore through exposed positions. Though wounded by shrapnel, RP remained on the bridge, steadfastly directing his ship's increasingly desperate defense. From his vantage point, the towering presence of Admiral Hipper now dominated the view, her guns flashing as they fired once more. Standard protocol dictated breaking off, seeking to escape into the cover of smoke or weather, preserving the remnants of the crew. Yet the Glowworm's maneuvering capabilities had been severely compromised, and Admiral Hipper showed no signs of relenting in its pursuit. In this dire situation, naval tradition and the commander's own understanding of duty pointed toward a final, desperate action. At 1835, the order was given to ram Admiral Hipper's hull at full speed. The engineering crew responded without hesitation, pushing the already strained turbines to their limits. Glowworm turned toward the starboard side of the enemy vessel, her bow swinging onto an intercept course as shells continued to strike around and upon her. This decision was not made out of panic, but rather a resolute determination to inflict as much damage as possible, even at the cost of the ship and her crew. The captain's decision to ram the enemy vessel was not driven solely by desperation, but rather a calculated final tactical maneuver. By 1913, his ship was mortally wounded and sinking rapidly. His crew faced certain death, whether from gunfire in the next 10 minutes or an immediate 1920 collision. However, ramming offered the possibility of inflicting significant damage on an enemy capital ship, potentially disrupting German naval operations for months. The kinetic energy of a destroyer's bow, even one as lightly constructed as Glowworm's, could prove devastating when driven at over 30 knots into a stationary or slower-moving target. The impact of steel hull against steel hull at such velocity could breach compartments, flood magazines, and potentially even cripple a heavy cruiser. Aboard the Admiral's vessel, the crew braced for the impending collision. The German cruiser's commanding officer, Kapitan High, reacted swiftly, ordering evasive maneuvers to turn the vessel's bow away from the approaching threat. However, the cruiser's greater mass hindered its agility, and it was still mid-turn when the British destroyer Glowworm closed the final distance. German secondary batteries unleashed a barrage of 4.1-inch shells and 37mm anti-aircraft fire directly into the destroyer's superstructure and hull at point-blank range. Crewmen perished at their stations, struck by projectiles or crushed by collapsing structures. Flames engulfed the forward sections, while the bridge area sustained multiple direct hits. Yet, through sheer momentum and the sacrifices of the engineering team, the German cruiser managed to evade the onslaught. The courageous crew of Glowworm refused to surrender, propelling their vessel forward despite the devastating damage that would have crippled most ships. Survivors later recounted the surreal final moments, as the massive gray silhouette of Admiral Hipper loomed ever larger, the scream of incoming shells, and the grim realization that death was imminent. The collision occurred at approximately 21:10 hours on April 8, 1940, as Glowworm's bow struck the starboard side of the cruiser at a shallow angle just aft of the bridge, at an estimated speed of 25 to 30 knots. The impact echoed across the water, the shriek of tearing metal as the destroyer's bow crumpled and rode up along the cruiser's hull. The destroyer's forceful advance propelled it sideways along Admiral Hipper's flank for several moments, its port side scraping against the cruiser's starboard plating. As the vessels collided, Glowworm's anchor, still secured in its housing, carved a lengthy gash through the German ship's hull plating. The physics of the impact heavily favored one vessel over the other. Glowworm's bow was utterly decimated, crushed back into its forward compartments. Yet Admiral Hipper's hull, engineered to withstand torpedo strikes and shelling, could not entirely resist the concentrated force of several hundred tons of steel ramming it at high speed. When the ships finally disengaged, Admiral Hipper bore a 130-foot gash along her side. The starboard flank of the vessel was severely compromised, with the breach extending below the waterline. Multiple compartments were exposed to the sea, and water poured in at an alarming rate, jeopardizing the cruiser's stability. Within minutes, the ship began to list heavily to starboard. Damage control teams frantically worked to shore up bulkheads and activate pumps, while the captain weighed the decision to continue towards Trondheim or abort the mission. For the Glowworm, the ramming proved catastrophic. Her bow was completely destroyed, and fires spread rapidly along her length as flooding accelerated through multiple hull breaches. The destroyer began to settle quickly by the bow. Around 30,925 hours, the order to abandon ship was given. Sailors who could reach the deck jumped into the icy North Sea waters claimed countless lives. Some had already perished at their posts, while others were trapped below as the compartments rapidly flooded. Glowworm capsized within minutes of the order to abandon ship, listing heavily to port as her forward sections became completely submerged. Briefly, the stern rose into the air, propellers visible above the surface, before the entire vessel vanished beneath the waves around 0930 hours. From the initial ramming to the final sinking, a mere 10 minutes had passed. Over 100 men found themselves in the water, most without life jackets due to the swift sinking and many already wounded from the preceding battle. The unforgiving North Sea showed no compassion, its frigid 6 to 8 degrees Celsius temperatures proving lethal. The seasoned mariner, faced with a perilous situation, contemplated his next move. Hypothermia, a relentless adversary, began to take hold within minutes, compromising judgment and motor skills in the frigid waters. Even the strongest swimmers succumbed, slipping into unconsciousness and ultimately, death, without the aid of flotation devices or timely rescue. Aboard the Admiral Hipper, Captain Hyde confronted his own daunting challenge. A gaping 130-foot breach below the waterline allowed seawater to pour into multiple compartments, despite the crew's damage control efforts. The cruiser had taken on a significant 5-degree list to starboard, and the flooding persisted. His orders were to land troops at Trondheim as part of the coordinated invasion, but the extent of the damage threatened to derail this critical objective. The perilous conditions threatened the very survival of the vessel. Simultaneously, the pressing 2438 tactical circumstances required urgent focus. Glowworm had relayed contact reports before engaging, alerting 2445 the Royal Navy to the presence of German warships in the area. Additional 2450 British ships could arrive at any time. Yet, despite these mounting pressures, High 2456 made a decision that embodied the timeless traditions of seafaring, transcending national allegiances. He ordered Admiral 2502 Hipper to pause and commence rescue operations for the Glowworm's survivors. 2507 German sailors swiftly deployed lines and lowered nets over the cruiser's hull. Lifeboats were launched, despite the risk this 25-14 posed to Admiral Hipper's combat readiness and the ongoing threat from British forces. The German crew labored 25-21 to pull the British sailors. The Glowworm's crew, many barely conscious from the frigid waters and others injured from the battle, were gradually pulled from the sea. For around 45 minutes, the rescue efforts persisted as the German cruiser Admiral Hipper remained largely stationary and vulnerable. Of the Glowworm's 149 crew members, 40 were saved, brought aboard the German vessel, and immediately provided with medical attention, warm clothing, and hot beverages. The German sailors treated their rescued enemies with the same care as their own injured crew, with several survivors later recounting acts of remarkable kindness. German sailors gave up their own dry garments, medical personnel worked tirelessly to revive men seemingly dead from hypothermia, and officers ensured the prisoners received the same rations as the crew. Lieutenant-Commander Roope was spotted in the water by numerous eyewitnesses from both vessels by 26-15. Several narratives depict him assisting other sailors in reaching rescue lines despite 26-22 his own injuries and fatigue. The Germans threw him a lifeline, and some 26-27 reports suggest he initially grasped it. However, whether due to wounds, hypothermia, or exhaustion, he lost his 26-34 grip and slipped beneath the waves. Other attempts to rescue him proved futile. 26-40 Gerard Roope perished in the North Sea on the morning of April 8, 1940, at the age of 35, 26-47 having commanded his ship for barely a year. His remains were never recovered. Alongside him were 108 26-54 other crew members, their names inscribed on naval memorials. The individual tales of bravery displayed by the crew during those final 27 minutes have largely faded from public consciousness. Admiral Hipper eventually managed to limp away from the scene, with her damage control teams having stabilized the flooding sufficiently to allow the ship to move, but the ramming had consequences beyond the immediate tactical situation. The cruiser required urgent repairs and could not continue to Trondheim, instead diverting to Germany, effectively removing it from the opening phase of the Norwegian campaign. The 130-foot gash required weeks in dry dock to properly fix, a period during which one of Germany's most formidable surface units remained idle as the Norwegian operation progressed. The small destroyer had inflicted significant damage on the predatory vessel. The sinking of HMS Glowworm received little immediate attention. The Norwegian campaign erupted into full-blown hostilities within hours of the initial engagement in April 1940. British forces confronted devastating losses across multiple battlefronts, as newspapers captivated readers with reports on the German invasion's startling triumph and the fall of Denmark, along with the desperate British efforts to hold Norway. The loss of a single destroyer in combat seemed almost routine compared to the unfolding scale of events. The 40 survivors entered German prisoner of war camps, where they would remain for the next 5 years. The events that transpired off the Norwegian coast that morning might have faded into the countless obscurities of naval warfare, were it not for an extraordinary act by the opposing commander who had witnessed it. Captain Hellmouth, the senior commander, Admiral Hipper, meticulously documented the events of the Glowworm's engagement in his official reports. His accounts portrayed the ramming attack and the actions of Lieutenant-Commander Roope with professional objectivity, devoid of propagandistic dismissiveness. Remarkably, Hipper went beyond the standard protocols, utilizing the still-functioning international conventions, to forward testimony to the British Admiralty. He specifically recommended that Roope be recognized for his courageous conduct. Such German officers praising their enemy counterparts for awards was exceptionally uncommon, especially in the ideologically charged climate of the Second World War. Hipper's testimony detailed Roope's tactical decisions, his unwavering refusal to surrender despite the insurmountable odds, and the bravery required to order and execute a. The harrowing account of the incident eventually reached the British capital, having been verified through Swiss intermediaries and officially documented in the naval archives. Wartime bureaucracy, however, moved at a sluggish pace, particularly when it came to the arduous process of recommending recipients for the prestigious Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor for acts of valor. Roope's case presented unique challenges, as most potential witnesses were either deceased or languishing in German prisoner of war camps. The chaotic circumstances surrounding the action, with no other British vessels present to corroborate the details, meant that the investigation had to rely in part on enemy reports. Throughout 1940 and into 1941, the Admiralty meticulously interviewed available survivors, obtained damage assessments of the Admiral Hipper through intelligence channels, and scrutinized the Glowworm's transmitted messages. On the 8th of April, the details that surfaced corroborated High's earlier assessment. Despite having viable options to retreat, Roope had engaged a superior force, skillfully maneuvering his vessel against overwhelming firepower, and ultimately delivering a final strike that crippled an enemy capital ship, though at the cost of his own life and most of his crew. Over 5 years after the action, and 2 months following Germany's surrender, the London Gazette on July 6, 1945, announced the posthumous award of the Victoria Cross to Lieutenant-Commander Gerard Roope. The citation commended his valor in confronting insurmountable odds and sacrificing himself to damage a significant enemy unit. His widow accepted the medal. A bronze cross forged from Russian artillery seized during the Crimean conflict, suspended from a scarlet 31.02 ribbon, Britain's supreme accolade for martial courage. Roope's name was inscribed upon 31.07. The comparatively brief roster of naval officers awarded the Victoria Cross amidst the Second World War. A mere 14 in 31 to 14 total out of countless thousands who served. The medal now resides within the 31 to 19 Imperial War Museum, a diminutive bronze cross symbolizing one morning's resolute stand in the chilly northern seas. The 31-26 skirmishes' strategic ramifications extended beyond a single vessel's sacrifice. Admiral Hipper's withdrawal from the 31-33 Norwegian campaign's initial phase impacted German naval dispositions and diminished the substantial covering force 31-39 available for the Trondheim landings. British analysis of the Royal Navy's internal studies on the Glowworm's engagement examined crucial aspects of destroyer combat, such as gun handling, damage control, and tactical maneuvers. These insights were incorporated into training programs, emphasizing the importance of maintaining offensive action even when outmatched and the psychological impact of aggressive destroyer tactics on enemy commanders. However, the action's most profound legacy lies in its revelation about the nature of courage and the refusal to accept predetermined outcomes. The Germans' dismissive labeling of British destroyers as tin cans was challenged by the Glowworm's defiant stand against superior forces. The technical assessment had deemed these vessels incapable of posing a serious threat to major warships in direct confrontation. While the analysis was sound from a purely mechanical standpoint, the crew and commander of the Glowworm refused to be constrained by such calculations. They fought with every weapon and tactic at their disposal, and when faced with certain demise, ensured their sacrifice would not be in vain. The 130-foot gash inflicted upon Admiral Hipper's hull embodied the triumph of human resolve over mathematical limitations. It proved that, against the odds, courage and determination could occasionally prevail. The passage chronicles the evolution of naval warfare, highlighting the remarkable advancements in ship design, weapon capabilities, and combat tactics over the past 8 decades. While modern destroyers now eclipse the size and firepower of the heavy cruisers of the 1940s, the fundamental question posed by the Glowworm's actions remains relevant. What does one do when the numbers suggest defeat is inevitable, and doctrine dictates withdrawal as the only rational choice? The Glowworm's decision to engage the enemy despite the overwhelming odds, ramming the Predator with its modest frame, proved that the Germans' dismissive tin can moniker failed to capture the true essence of these vessels. The narrative traces the progression from a time when the mathematical disadvantage was so severe that fighting was deemed futile, to an era where faster ships, more powerful weapons, and long-range missile engagements have transformed naval combat. Yet, the core dilemma endures. How does one respond when survival seems to demand accepting defeat, even as one's training and instincts urge defiance? The Glowworm's bold and unconventional actions stand as a testament to the enduring human spirit, challenging the notion that numerical superiority alone determines the outcome of a battle. This historic encounter serves as a poignant reminder that the true measure of a vessel, and the crew that sails it, may lie not in its size or armaments, but in the intangible qualities of courage, determination, and the refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. On the morning of April 8, 1940, a German heavy cruiser managed to sink an enemy vessel, despite the general inability of such ships to overpower their lighter counterparts. This unexpected success occurred at precisely 34 minutes and 18 seconds past the hour.